people, like those with gray hair, and people who also are children. So I would like to start by just giving a brief introduction to the speakers and the order in which they will speak. The first speaker is Tom Pei, and Tom Pei is the chairman of wayfinder.org, which also he does other things as well, which he will tell you about. The second speaker will be Lidia Best, who has been formerly working directly with the European Disability Forum, and also is the president of the National Association of Deaf People and is vice chair of the JCA. Then we have Masahito Kawamori. Masahito Kawamori is a professor at Keio University. He also is the rapporteur for the accessibility question in the ITUT, which it makes the standards that we use. And also he works in conjunction with ITUR with audiovisual accessibility. And then the last person is also part of the ITU process as well. This is, I'm not sure to call you the president or the chairman, Axel Lebois, who is the head of G3ICT. And GCI3T is the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs, which is a member of all three sectors of the ITU, specifically dealing with persons with disabilities, older persons, and also dealing with industry, making those standards knowledgeable to those industries so that they will deploy and implement them. And he also is responsible for the E-Enabling Summit, which happens every year. Unfortunately, this year it is canceled due to COVID-19. So he will be the last speaker, and then we'll do a little wrap up. So first of all, thank you very much for attending, and I would like to allow Tom to go ahead and give his presentation. Thank you. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, thank you, Andrea. I'm Tom Pei, and as Andrea said, I wear a few hats. One is I'm the chairman and managing director of a company called Waymap that deploys audio-based navigation, indoor and outdoor navigation across cities, hoping to add to the smart city developments. I'm also the chief executive of the Royal Society for Blind Children, and it is from that charity that the Wayfinder and Waymap have evolved. I'm really delighted to be on the panel today and to thank Masahito Kawamori and Axel Lebois in particular, because what they have done is that they have made it very possible for audio-based navigation to be designed with disabled people in mind. We started out in this space a number of years back. Axel really encouraged us to do that. I'm really proud to say that with the help of ITU and now it's CTA, we are looking at expanding audio-based indoor and outdoor navigation from being usable by people with sight loss to those with learning difficulties and intellectual disabilities. So that should make it very, very much easier for people to get around. Smart city is, is a term that we've kind of gotten used to. It, for me, it means a city that uses an Internet of Things, and also getting the data from the Internet of Things to make services more efficient and effective for people. And of course, it is in the last word that we find that the word disabled doesn't necessarily appear, although it is implied. And the reason why it doesn't appear there is because people who tend to drive data and Internet of Things are not normally known for following the principles of inclusive design set out in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. They will aspire to doing it, but they tend to do it as an afterthought. What needs to happen in smart city environments is that that is built in upfront. So if we look at the area in which WMAP is interested, over the past 3 to 5 years, there's been an explosion in the use of apps, smart city apps on smartphones for people to get around. In fact, recent surveys show that about 60% of people with smartphones consistently use them to get around cities and towns. That is something that would not have happened. You know, well, clearly it wasn't possible before the technology would happen. But what hasn't happened is that increase in ability to navigate has not been made accessible to disabled people. So as a result, the average blind person uses 1.4 routes regularly. That is an amazing, you know, that if you say that to a person who wasn't blind, they would be really, you know, that's like being in jail. It's the equivalent of a restriction on mobility. That has to change. And of course, retrofitting in things just becomes too complicated. So, yeah, so so in smart cities, what is really important is that we, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the various disability discrimination acts that are being enacted in countries are rigorously applied to the area of design as much as it is to the area of data, of infrastructure design and or intelligent design as it is to building design. You know, a lot of work has been done making transport more accessible, making buildings more accessible. But actually, a recent study in the UK showed that this has had minimal effect on people, disabled people using public transport. And that there is an enormous amount of lack of confidence in using public transport because the disabled person is less confident of being able to complete the journey and get home again using public transport. So disabled people are higher users of taxis and private hire vehicles. This has to stop. As I said, I am really proud to be sharing the on this panel with people who are dedicated and have a long history of achievement in ensuring that the principles of inclusive design are designed into the process. And I want to thank the ITU for bringing forward F921, which I think was one of the world's first standards to ensure that the needs of blind people were designed into the into audio-based navigation. And this has spawned an industry of compliance. And more there are companies out there that are ensuring that blind people can get around. And once we've completed the work for those with learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities, then they too will be let out of jail. So thank you very much, Andrea, for inviting me today.
Well, thank you, Tom, for speaking. People may not realize that you yourself, if you don't mind me exposing this, have visual difficulties as well, and that you came to us in the ITU and opened our eyes to the different problems that you had. And we're very grateful to you for joining the standardization process that we do, because we encourage all people to come to the ITU, especially those who have knowledge of disability because they have the disability. So thank you very much, Tom.
Yeah, thank you.
Questions for you at the end if there's time. And if not, we will ask you to write them in the chat box or to email our JCA, Joint Coordination Activity on Accessibility and Human Factors. We will have those questions disseminated to the speakers, because I'd rather you don't listen to me, you listen to them. Thank you, Tom. The next speaker is going to be Lidia Best. So if Tom, you'd close your video for me. Thank you. And Lidia, you have a presentation slide. Lidia is the president of the National Association of Deaf People and is vice chair of the JCA. We're going to have this, I think the slides are up, just one moment. Right, go ahead, Lidia, please.
Thank you. Good morning, evening, or afternoon, wherever everybody is. It's a great pleasure to be able to present to you how we can include persons who are deaf or hard of hearing in the age of smart cities. And it's a very timely topic. And I'm hoping that we will have some wonderful discussions afterwards. Thank you. Next slide. When we talk about ICT and accessibility for persons who are deaf or hard of hearing, we also need to understand how many of us are there. And according to the World Health Organization, we are looking at over 5% of the world population, or 466 million, who have disabled hearing loss. But if we add to this persons who might have a mild hearing loss, then we are looking at 10% or even more, which is very important. We also, it's important to understand that the main impact of hearing loss is our ability to communicate with others. Next slide. And when we talk about ability to communicate with others, the most important, I think, across everyone, when we're looking at it, is access to services in general. And that access could be via telephones, or it could be websites. It could be any different ways in digital platforms now and in smart cities. And what we do require for planners of the smart cities to look at the view of a person with disabilities, precisely as Tom has just spoken earlier on, from the design early stages of the services, and to include persons with disabilities from the outset in how to make sure the services are designed. The most important part of the telephones is that to ensure that persons who are deaf or hard of hearing have the equivalent unrestricted manner to make those calls and to receive calls. And when we're looking, for example, at SMS, so the people who may not be online, but still need to be included, when you bear in mind that over 65 years old may not always be ICT aware, then those SMS systems need to be two ways to ensure that we can actually reply to the SMS as well. Next slide. And with COVID-19, we have a new normal, which we are actually dealing with today as well. So are we accessible when we are organizing our workplaces, events online? Because the importance is that access to communication is the priority for persons who are deaf or hard of hearing. However, what we are coming across quite often is that organizers do lack awareness of what online platforms can do or cannot do. And quite often we receive responses such as technology is not there, or it's too expensive. And actually organizing online event is less expensive than a physical event. So when we are looking at this, one of the most important kind of guidelines, if you would like to say, from ITU recently are the overview of remote captioning services and guideline for supporting remote meetings for all. So please look at the JCA website where all these different accessibility guidelines are there, and to ensure that you have the necessary knowledge you may wish to have. Next slide, please. When we talk about access to information in general in smart city, we looking at a visual way of information as well as the audible way. Many people who are hard of hearing prefer the audible way when they can use the telecalls, for example, and they can communicate with everyone in the ticket booths with using the enhanced hearing facilities. The same thing goes to people who use sign language, who may need to communicate with staff. But also what is important and something what we have seen during COVID-19 pandemic high times is that many of the broadcasts were not fully captioned or with sign language interpretation. And this is kind of information for everyone where we need to improve on this. It is important and it's essential, but all the information is provided for every citizen and every citizen of the country or the city. Thank you. What I would also like to add, and this is something what earlier Tom has mentioned, persons with disabilities need to be included at the design of the services, design of any planning before it being implemented. Quite often we come across a situation when we have to deal with something what needs to be redone again. It's costly. Why not to involve us first, and then we can improve the situations for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Lidia. Thank you very much. And I think your point is well taken about the fact that we need to include persons with disabilities. You yourself have a profound hearing loss, and we've had you working with us for the last 3 years in ITUT Study Group 16. And your insight to what is needed has been invaluable. And I want to thank you for your participation and your involvement in ITU, because without people like you who know the problem firsthand, we wouldn't know. So thank you for this presentation, Lidia. I would like to now introduce and invite Masahito Kawamori. He is from Japan. He is very active in his own country. He is a professor at Keio University and the Rapporteur for Study Group 16, question 26 in the ITUT, which is the accessibility question. He is responsible for many of the new work items that we work on to make standards for industry to deploy and for the ITU to use. Masahito, would you like to give your presentation, please?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrea, for your kind introduction. I'd like to talk a little bit about smart cities and ICT, as well as accessibility, how important it is to include accessibility from the very start, as the other speakers already mentioned. Next, please. So this is a view of smart cities. On the right-hand side, this is a more or less a traditional view of smart cities with all the new features of the city, new energy sources, advancement in transportation, and so on. On the left-hand side, you see Toyota's new idea about they call woven city, presented at the CES 2020 at Las Vegas this year. It is a new city that Toyota is going to build, and this will be one idea of what an inclusive smart city will look like. Next, please. So I'd like to emphasize that smart cities must be inclusive, because smart city, in a sense, is a partially artificial, planned, designed city, assuming that cities would not be smart if left built without any plan. Since a city is home to all kinds of people with various differences and diversity, a smart city must be inclusive, hence accessible. A smart city must be planned and designed as an inclusive city from the very beginning. Next, please. I'd like to touch on the 3 concepts that are very important to create an inclusive smart city. accessibility is a concept that can be defined as designing products, devices, services, or environments for people with disabilities. A very closely related concept, universal design, is the process of creating products that are usable by people with the widest possible range of abilities, operating within the widest possible range of situations. And we also have the concept of inclusive design, which is the design of an environment so that it can be accessed and used by as many people as possible, regardless of age, gender, and disability. So as you can see, all of these three concepts combined together are needed to create an inclusive smart city. Next, please. These are some visions of what an inclusive smart city will look like. On the left-hand side, we have this audio guided navigation system, which we call Wayfinder, and we standardized in ITUT, which will guide visually impaired people through indoor as well as outdoor environments. On the right-hand side, you can see smart and inclusive public transportation, where all different kinds of people can take a ride. ITUT have been working with persons with disabilities to define those standards. Next, please. Among those, as Lidia just mentioned, we have standards for video remote sign language interpretation on the left-hand side, and also telecom relay service, such as on the right-hand side, which is captioned telephone. And these inclusive technologies and accessible technologies should be part of public infrastructure of a smart city from the very beginning. Next, please. And disability, quote unquote, unquote, an inclusive design for smart city. We have to say that disability is not something special to persons with disabilities. Everybody makes errors, and errors are caused by some inability, physical or mental, to cope with a situation. Hence, everybody is somewhat disabled sometimes. Especially as one gets older, one tends to make sensory errors, many errors, and smart city must accommodate such cases of quote unquote disability. Next, please. For example, in the United States, the onset of age-related vision loss can be seen to begin in people in their late 40s or early 50s. So as you can see in the graph, from the age group of 50 to 64, all of a sudden, people are losing sights. Next, please. And also hearing loss and age-related issues. In Japan, after the age of 65, the number of hearing loss suddenly increases. Over the age of 80, about 80% is hard of hearing. Next, please. Again, in the case of Japan, which is known to be the fastest aging society in the world, the people over the age of 65 accounts for 27.3% of the population in Japan. This may imply that over 30% of the population probably have either vision loss or a hearing problem. So aging society is a proof that a smart city needs to be inclusive. Next, please. Accessibility as a design principle of a smart city. By designing a smart city with accessibility, it will be universally applicable for everyone. Accessibility will raise the level of security and safety requirements. And if the car can be driven safely by a deaf-blind person, anybody can drive that car safely. Likewise, If the city can be navigable by a blind person, then anyone can safely go about the city. So from the very beginning, we have to design a city inclusive. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's all my presentation, and I would like to also show a short video clip that shows how COVID-19 can affect the persons with disabilities and how we should take them into account. Please, the video, can you show it?
$690 million persons with disabilities in Asia Pacific already excluded before COVID-19. 690 million persons with disabilities in Asia Pacific already excluded before COVID-19. The disability community faces new normals.
Okay, I think the video has stopped, so I will cancel the video for the benefit of time.
Medicine, no soap. Oh. Everything stopped. What if my parents die?
No rights, no tourists, no money. No rights, no tourists, no money.
This lockdown has been so difficult for Naeem, who has autism. He has broken his iPad and his keyboard just because of this.
COVID-19 information for the public is not always made accessible to persons with disabilities, especially those of us who rely on the use of computer screen reading software.
Persons with psychosocial disabilities who are institutionalized are at much greater risk. They have access to a very few amount of information.
All health systems are stretched. Tough call, who to save and who to let die.
We have crippling expenses and empty coffers. It is now so difficult to raise funds. Adapt to thrive.
In Bangladesh, CDT and many other organizations of persons with disabilities distribute relief packages, create awareness, and promote teletherapy in community for our fellow persons with disabilities. But the good thing is that we have a long-term partnership with the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief, and they have issued this directive to all district commissioners to implement disability-inclusive COVID-19 responses.
We use Filipino Sign Language. When COVID-19 started, the media did not have sign language interpretation. We deaf persons broke information barriers. Now we have sign language interpretation for the news. We relay medical consultations and information with easy-to-understand infographics. We hope to partner with our government and experts for sustainable, accessible sign language communication systems.
In the new reality, we must adapt to new normals.
Every life matters. We are 690 million. We are fourth.
Leave us not behind.
Leave us not behind.
Leave us not behind.
Leave us not behind.
Let us not behind.
Leave us not behind. Leave us not behind.
Leave us not behind.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you, Masahito. That was really interesting. And for those of you who notice that we don't have sign language, unfortunately, we have a situation where people have to request sign language before we can actually bring it on. We had 2 examples of sign language to show you that there's a different sign language for every country. You will see that there is what was one in the window, which was Japanese sign language, and then you saw different sign languages from different countries. So if someone out there did not get any sign language, and we can only provide international sign during international events, unless specifically requested, I do apologize. We had this problem last year, and I'll make sure it's rectified. Now, I'd like to move on to Axel Lebois, who, again, are you the chairman or the president of G3ICT?
I'm a president of G3ICT.
You're a president. Okay. And that's the global initiative of inclusive ICTs. Would you like to give your presentation, please? Thank you.
I'd be happy to. So if we can start the presentation, I wanted to first thank everyone, and especially the ITU, for organizing the session today. The examples we just saw are very telling as to how much a gap exists between persons with disabilities and the mainstream population in terms of digital accessibility. And I would like to come back for just 1 minute on the global framework that exists today for digital accessibility, which is defined by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As many of you know, the convention was passed now 14 years ago, and its Article 9 stipulates that state parties should actually ensure that accessibility for persons with disabilities is made available for transportation, the built environment, and information and communication technology. So it really is a legal obligation for all state parties. That's 181 countries today around the world, particularly the entire world, has signed up the convention. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is there is today virtually no digital interface that cannot be made accessible. And I think it's a very important thing to remember. Solutions exist out there. They are available in the marketplace. They can be implemented in most cases, from television to software to websites to video programming or television and so on and so forth. So there is really no obstacle from a technology standpoint to make things accessible to persons with disabilities and aging person, matters of digital accessibility. So why is then an ongoing gap between, on one hand, the obligation of state parties to the convention, the availability of solutions, and the actual reality? So this is what I would like to explore today, to sum up the different presentations we have heard earlier. So to go through some of those fundamental issues, I will use the 2020 edition of the DARE Index. That's a benchmarking tool we use in collaboration with advocates around the world for advocates to do comparisons within their own countries and jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So this year we surveyed 137 countries, which basically represent 90% of the world population. And we did that within the advocacy division of G3ICT in collaboration with Disabled People International and regional advocacy organizations. And all countries have panelists who are organizations of persons with disabilities or accessibility experts. And so what we do is every edition we ask those local panelists to evaluate country commitments, how they put in place their legislation, regulation, policies, and programs that reflect the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Do they have the capacity to implement those policies, legislation, regulations, or programs? And what are the actual outcomes for persons with disabilities? In other terms, is digital accessibility reaching out to persons with disabilities? Next slide, please. So first, a couple of good news, which I really want to emphasize, because there is progress out there, but it's not too visible, unfortunately, but yet it's a really important background to understand. First of all, in 2020, 89% of the countries have now a general law that protects the rights of persons with disabilities. And if you look at the situation 20 years ago, you would have probably like less than 20% of the countries with a general law protecting the rights of persons with disabilities. So the convention had a huge impact worldwide on the legal framework that protects the rights of persons with disabilities. The second item which I want to emphasize is that this year we noted that 68% of countries have a definition in their legislation of reasonable accommodation. Back in 2006, when the convention was launched, 4 countries around the world had a definition of reasonable accommodation. And that's extremely important because it's the legal foundation for persons with disabilities to eventually request accommodation to be made available. And in the text of the convention, as many of you know, the denial of reasonable accommodation equals discrimination. So in many countries, it's a very powerful legal instrument. And the third element I wanted to emphasize is that there is now, in a majority of countries, legal definition of accessibility that includes ICT. And there again, you can see from 2018 to 2020, 10% more countries have actually included those definitions. And that, of course, is extremely important. That means that in 59% of countries, there is a law that says that accessibility means access to the built environment, transportation, and ICTs. And that gives a foundation for then sectorial policies in education, in audiovisual, in all aspects of digital life to be implemented. So it's a real good progress. And I want to acknowledge the very important impact that the ITU had with its programs for telecom regulators and ministers of ICTs around the world to promote the notion that ICTs have to be included in accessibility definitions in the legislations. And it's also something that we did in partnership with ITU through the model policy reports that we published together. Next slide, please. Now, the only caveat and the bad news following that set of good news is that we still see the level of implementation of digital accessibility to be extremely low. And so I selected 3 areas which have an impact, obviously, on the discussion today. We heard Lidia talk about television and the lack of accessibility of television, and we saw in the video that Masahito Kawamori projected the importance for persons with disabilities with hearing loss to have accessible television, for instance. It's also true, by the way, for blind person who can really enjoy the benefits of audio description. In 2020, today, 39% of the countries do not have any policy for accessible television, and 7% have no implementation whatsoever. So that's 46% of the countries around the world have no policy or no policy implemented at all for accessible television. And even if you look at the rest of the world, 26% of the countries have only a minimum level of implementation, which typically is, certain segments of the program that are critical, but not mainstream programs. And then partial 24%. Very few countries have a substantial or full implementation of accessible television. And you go to the web accessibility domain, 42% of countries have no policy for web accessibility, and 4% have a policy but no implementation. That's 46% in total. And so we see it's similar to the television situation. basically half of the world is not yet into web accessibility implementation. Now for e-government and smart cities, our topic today, 50% of countries have no policy whatsoever. 4% have policies but no implementation. And then when you look at the level of implementation, 23% of countries are still at the minimum level and 18% partial. Very few countries, 4%, have a substantial level of implementation. So it tells you that we already have a significant gap. As to why is it that, again, obligations are there, countries are recognizing the need for ICT accessibility, but yet the implementation is failing. So what's up? Next slide, please. So from all our surveys over the years, we identified through regression analysis what were the variables in a country that would actually cause a country to fail in implementation. Well, the number one reason is the lack of involvement of persons with disabilities in policy making on ICT accessibility. And when I say policy making, it's being part of the elaboration of the policies and programs, but also in their monitoring. And it's easy to understand, if you don't ask persons with disability what they need, what are the best solutions for their local conditions, how to monitor the progress of implementation, how to correct potential technical issues, how can you actually deploy an effective service? You just can't. So many organizations, including large private sector organizations and governments, have actually adopted very, very elaborate processes to involve persons with disabilities in that policy making process. And almost ineluctably, they get great results. And so I think if anything had to be done, member states of ITU and CRPD signatories and ratifying countries should really set a priority to involve persons with disabilities in the elaboration of policies and programs related to ICT accessibility. Also, the other issue that we see around the world is that the capacity within government is limited. For instance, 39% of countries have any kind of government entity that specifically focuses on ICT accessibility. It means that 61% of countries don't have any. So if there is no one in the government that can actually deal with ICT accessibility, it's kind of difficult, obviously, to make any significant progress. Similarly, there is a lack of education and professional training around the world on ICT accessibility. Only 38% of countries report that they have any kind of courses on ICT accessibility or for major universities or through educational services in the country. So it means that in 62% of the countries, there is no resource for people to learn about how to make things digitally accessible. And then last but not the least, the reference to standard developments is present in 44% of countries. I would say that if you don't have a reference to standard, it's very hard to deploy policies and programs because you don't have a framework to do so. So 56% of countries have no reference to ICT accessibility nowadays. Next slide, please. A few years ago, coming back to smart cities, we did a survey around experts around the world, and they actually also mentioned that 77% of them said that key success factor for accessible smart cities was the involvement of persons with disabilities. And of course, requiring compliance with international standards, implementing public policies, and so on and so forth followed suit. But again, the involvement of persons with disabilities is the top #1 success factor to get implementation to work. Next slide, please. I would like to conclude by saying that regarding smart cities, we have been doing some work over the past few years with Smart Cities for initiative, we translated the toolkit for smart cities in 10 languages. And in that toolkit, there are guides to standards that are priorities for cities to consider, ways for cities to adopt procurement policies, strategies to communicate the case for digital inclusion, carrying a database of solutions for smart cities, having an inclusive innovation kind of playbook for new services for cities. And then most importantly, we developed a maturity model to assess cities. So we have been working for the past 2 years with cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, or Mexico City, or Guadalajara on doing week-long audits with their management team and local stakeholders, organizations for persons with disabilities, to systematically analyze the gaps in accessibility of those digital services in those cities. And it's a very, very, very useful process. Having those multi-stakeholders work together on identifying issues is really the best way to get going with new solutions and close the gap. So next slide, please. So with that, I would like to thank you very much. The topic of digital accessibility is probably one of the biggest opportunities nowadays with the growth of virtual environments. And again, I want to thank you all for paying attention to it and for the organizer of this afternoon of this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Axel. I appreciate your getting up at 6:30 in the morning because you're coming from the United States. And I'll just put on my video for a minute. I've just noticed something. Everybody that's in the participants box can do a question, but the people, I don't see where the hand raising is for people who are just tuning in to listen to us to ask questions. It almost seems as if the panelists and the WSIS team put themselves in what should be the attendees box because there's no hand raising. So one of the things I think we have to change to be more accessible in using Zoom is to make a very clear hand raising operation. So you may in fact not be able, if you are listening to us, to ask us a question right now. What I'd like to say is that Karu, who is our wonderful secretariat for the joint coordination activity on accessibility and human factors, she takes care of us and tells us what to do pretty much. She's the boss. She will put in the chat box the correct email address for you to write and address any questions that you have to the panelists or to myself. Because I think it's important that you have an open two-way conversation with us. We at the ITU, the JCA, I want to point out, is open to people who are not members of the ITU. They can join. They can be part of an organization of persons with disabilities. They can be an individual with a disability. They can be an individual who has a child who has disabilities. They can join the joint coordination activity on accessibility and human factors without having to pay a fee for the purpose of promoting, helping, and sharing information with the joint coordination activity, the JCA, on accessibility and human factors, AHF, because the JCA works in every sector of the ITU. It works in the D sector, which is for developing countries. It works in the R sector, which is radio and broadcasting. It works in the T sector to make standards that hopefully industry will deploy and use. So we have 10 minutes. If somebody would like to write a question, or if there is a way that the technical department of WSIS can figure out how people who are in the participants list can raise their hand, I would be grateful. We'd love to have a question, or they can type it in the chat box. I think that's probably the only way it's going to happen. So Vladimir, if you can hear me, can you give me an explanation?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you for all participants. I have listed this information in chat to all attendees. Anyone, including attendees, can raise their hand.
How?
So please, if you have this, if you have any questions and you want to join this session verbally, you go to your name appearing, and next, once you scroll your cursor on it, there's an option to raise hand. Click on it if you would like to raise one.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. This is news to me because the ones that we have is very clear. It says raise your hand. So this is something I think we need to explain in the beginning. Have we got anybody raising their hand? Where's Olaf? He usually has something to say. I know he's online. Well, there it is. It's now appeared. Thank you.
Andrea, it's Andy Quested. How are you?
Hi.
I can even turn my camera. I can't turn my camera on. I ran a session a couple of days ago, and I was thinking about you, and you were mentioned. We tried something new as an experiment with a company that I'd seen at the EBU that was taking the human captions, and it's very important that we emphasize human generated captions. And we actually ran 10 languages of captioning during our session. And just to let you know, it's one of the things I want to start to bring into the Rapporteur group, the Interceptor Rapporteur group at our next meeting, and to also contribute to the ITUD work, because I think it's now really important we start to look at hybrid technologies to increase the amount of accessibility based on human interaction with our audience. I just wondered if you, what the panelists thought.
Who would like to take that question? I'm going to give it to Masahito, whether he likes it or not.
Yeah, I was on the panel actually that Andy was referring to, and that was a great technology. I think that was very useful. I think it has many features that will be in the future will be very, very useful, alongside with artificial intelligence and also automatic speech recognition. And actually during our session, before the actual session, I think there were about 100 languages that can be translated. So that was a very impressive demonstration. And I think surely we can explore the possibility to be included in the standards. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you also, Andy. There is one comment I'd like to make about machine captioning, if we call it that. People who have hearing impairments and people who are profoundly deaf pronounce words differently. So there is that problem that the machine captioning would have to be trained, and everybody who has this particular difficulty pronounces words a little differently. So there is that impediment, but it could possibly be overcome. There's nothing that can beat us. The humans are the best. So we could probably find a way to accommodate that. Lidia, do you want to make a comment on that? Oh, Masahito, do you want to continue?
Yeah, just to, Andy's point, I think Andy can correct me if I'm wrong. The captioning is done by human. It's a human caption, but the translation is done by machine.
Got it.
So the machine translates into 100 languages, but the original caption is made by a human being. So it's human caption based machine translation. Andy, is that correct?
Thank you, Masahito. I just wanted to make sure that people understood the difference between human captioning and captioning that's done by machine. Lidia is very clear on that particular aspect. Lidia, do you want to add anything to that? What I have said? Are you muted? You're muted. You're muted. I'm sorry, Lidia.
Lidia, you're muted.
Andrea, you're also muted.
Yes.
Here I am. Would the host not mute any of the speakers or panelists, please? Lidia, sorry, now you're unmuted. Lidia? She's still muted. Axel, I'm going to just move to you.
Yes, so it's a very delicate situation because we all know the importance of accuracy for captioning. In some cases, inaccurate captioning can lead to absolute disaster for persons with disabilities. So we have to keep in mind it's just not something nice to have. It's really indispensable to have accuracy, complete accuracy. Now, having said that, technology is progressing quickly. Even Alexa understands my French accent in English, so it tells you how far the technology has gone. But we have seen in times of stress, like over the past few months, in the United States, the FCC has placed orders to allow automatic captioning to be used for telephony. And so the issue, I think, for all of us is we don't have actual metrics to actually benchmark what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And I think for the advocates who really want to focus on making progress, an important step would be to define metrics for quality of service in captioning. And we discussed that earlier, I know within our little delegation at the ITU, but you know, without it, we are not basing our judgment on facts, and we cannot do much progress, I think. So again, I think it's very important to come to some quality of service metrics and possibly standardizing the way those metrics are calculated.
Well, thank you very much, Axel. We've come to the end of our time. Sorry about the confusion about unmuting Lidia, but
Lidia is now unmute.
Go ahead, quick. We haven't got much time. Go ahead, Lidia.
Thank you. What I would like to say is I have observed a similar kind of demonstrations where a captioner will be typing in English and then using automatic translation system over Wi-Fi most time, and trying to provide accessibility in different languages. There is an ethical problem here. How do you know what you are outputting in different languages if you don't know this language? And what I have seen in Polish language, I am native Polish, trying to use translations from English to Polish, it doesn't always work. And sometimes it does not provide the equivalent access to the persons who are deaf or hard of hearing. And I think that is a very important point. For me, if anybody wants to provide access in different languages, there needs to be control in places to ensure that offer languages are provided in the correct manner. Otherwise, we will have a situation when instead of providing accessibility, we are actually again excluding people who need the access. So this is my piece on that. And it is important. It is a new technologies, and I'm not against that, but I just want to make sure that there are right systems in place to ensure that we are not just trying to cut the corners and not to think about what do we mean by providing access in different languages. Thank you.
Thank you, Lidia. We have come to the end of the road, and I knew we wouldn't have time for any questions. And I do know that we have put in the chat box how we all can be reached. And I want to thank Gitanjali and Ruth and everyone at WSIS for making this possible. And next time we'll make sure that we have international sign for those people who would prefer to be able to understand what's going on in international sign language. So thank you very much. Any last quick comments? You got 1 second, basically. Masahito, last sentence. You're muted. You're muted.
Access, I think Max's point is very correct, and I think we should try to standardize all those issues related to smart cities, as well as this automatic translation and automatic speech recognition. And ITUT can provide a very good platform for that as well. So I'd like to welcome everyone.
Thank you, Masahito. Axel, one quick last sentence.
I think it's certainly a great opportunity to continue working at the ITU to standardize a bit further. And Masahito, I'm game. I would love to do it.
Lidia, you had yours. I'm going to say thank you for everyone who's participated. And again, thank you to the WSIS team. And we hope we can do this again. Thank you very much. The session is finished. Oh, you want one more
Andrea,
thing? Go ahead.
No, the video, the last video. You're supposed to play.
I'm supposed to play a last video. Do we have time? Don't think so. Sorry.
And now. Okay, so I think the video is over.